Welcome to Green Building Matters, the podcast that matters for green building professionals. Learn insight in green buildings as we interview today's experts in LEED and WELL. We'll learn from their career paths, war stories, and all things green, because green building matters. And now our host, and yes, he has every LEED and WELL credential. Here's Charlie Cicchetti.
Be sure to check out the Green Building Matters community, where you can have unlimited exam prep for any of the professional credential exams you're tackling next, as well as putting your continuing education on autopilot, saving time with GBS reporting your hours on your behalf. Check it out, gbes.com/join. Now, enjoy this episode of the Green Building Matters podcast.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the next episode of the Green Building Matters podcast. I'm your host, Charlie Cicchetti. We've got another green building professional and a LEED fellow with us, Gene Olp, coming to us from Dallas, Texas. He's FAIA. He's the president at GGO Architects, and I can't wait to get into his story. Gary, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Charlie.
You know, as we're recording this, we're in some strange times, but you and I have already been brainstorming a little bit about what happens when we get through this and come out of it. And, I think we all just need to be thinking right now, what does all this make possible? And that's where I want to, in a little bit, ask you about some things coming around the corner. But Gary, with all my guests, I ask them, hey, what's your origin story? So where'd you grow up and where'd you go to school?
Grew up in Wisconsin, near Milwaukee. And, so as a kid, just the plains of Wisconsin, my grandparents lived in central Wisconsin. The other parents lived in Milwaukee. We pretty much were suburban. My dad had built a house in a suburb. My earliest memories were was living with my grandparents. I was the first child in Cudahy, Wisconsin, which is a very German, Polish neighborhood, tavern on every corner. Cool. Social life was the tavern. And I can remember being in the tavern, listening to live music and other kids and all that sort of thing. And then we moved out to the suburban house. We were about the third or fourth home in that subdivision. All around, we were surrounded by just farms, just fields, hay fields. So as a kid, there were a lot of houses under construction, and we were very adept at scavenging materials out of the scrap piles. I won't say we didn't grab the occasional new 2x6 or 2x8, but we would build incredible forts and we'd build incredible tree houses. And my dad says I was always the leader of the pack. I was the one who was, kind of directing the construction. And I remember we built some doozies. We built some great things. But that was a function, I think, of growing up in a subdivision that was brand new. And, we had all that access to it, played a lot of baseball. We kind of had our own sandlot baseball field, and we would dig. There was a big bar ditch across from our house and across the field where all the fields drained to. So in the wintertime, it would ice over, and we'd sweep it and play hockey. And then the other thing about it was it would get filled with snow by the middle of winter, and we would dig these incredible snow forts in there. So that was pretty much the childhood. Yeah. Dad then was recruited. He worked for a company called Charter Wire in Milwaukee. Interesting company. They cold rolled and drew specialty shape wires. Dad was transferred to Philadelphia. Charter Wire bought a plant out there. Dad was sent out there to be a plant engineer and manager. Met his partner out there who was a metallurgist, and they relocated to Orrville, Ohio, my sophomore year, and they built and developed their own steel mill until they both retired. So about that time, I worked in the steel mill, learned how to use, machine tools, lathes, torches, all those sorts of things. Went to college. When I went to college at the University of Cincinnati, I had the opportunity Cincinnati has a co-op program, and you're required to have 6 quarters of apprenticeship. And it can be, 1 quarter could be in like some specialty study program, but the other 5, you have to be either working construction or in a professional office. And when my grandfather in central Wisconsin found out that I had to do this, he said, well, we'll teach you how to be an architect. My friend Norm Broad is a builder up here. And I've been bragging you up to Norm forever. And he said he'll hire you and teach you how to be a carpenter. It was pretty cool. So my first quarter, that's what I did. I went up there and I worked with Norm, and it was an eye-opening experience. A lot of fun. My first day on the job, I had to nail down 1,500 square feet of plywood subfloor. And I had my grandfather give me a hammer. At the end of the day, was wrapping gauze around my hand because it was so blistered up. It was terrible. And Norm came over and grabs my hand and looks at it and he goes, "Oh my God, let me see that hammer." He gets the hammer and he looks at it and he goes, "What a piece of bleep." Threw it out in the woods and he went out to his truck and gave me a brand new plumb hammer. And he showed me the difference, how a hammer needs to balance. Yeah. And the thing I remember most was he said, when you learn how to swing a good hammer, it sings. And I've never forgotten that. And that's true. When you hear people, tap, 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 it doesn't sing. And those framing carpenters, and I can still do it to this day with a finish hammer or a framing hammer. When you make that, when you're swinging that hammer right, a balanced hammer, it does sing. And those guys used to be able to drive a 16 penny nail with 3 strikes. Tap, set it, bam, last strike would set it. And they were good. And they would set it. Well, nail guns have taken over. And I'm certainly one to tell you that I would rather use a nail gun for everything rather than pounding nails. But anyway, that was a great experience working there. I wound up going back up there for 2 summers, actually double section. Norm wanted to keep me and his son out of trouble. His son had a drinking problem, so he wanted to keep him out of trouble. So Norm gave us a lot, set us up with a credit line at a building supply store, and Dick and I were to build the house over the summer. Wow. At the end of the summer, we sold it, and then Dick and I split the profits. And so when we weren't working for Norm during the day, on the weekends and evenings, we were building this house.
Well, that's one of my next questions is mentor. It sounds like, wow, someone gave you an entrepreneurial opportunity early, for sure. What a
exactly. Ordering materials, getting the materials delivered on time. We would recruit other guys our age, teasing them with getting paid, but also brats and beer, and to make the whole thing work. So not only the entrepreneurial aspect, but also, scheduling, all of that goes with it, and doing pretty much everything.
Absolutely.
In the house, and then selling it and getting a nice check at the end of the day. That was really good. And then, of course, I finished up the University of Cincinnati and stayed in Ohio for about 5 years, working for a firm that I co-opted with on my other internships. Yeah. And then didn't want to stay in Ohio for a lot of reasons. And I had designed when I was on co-op student, I had an opportunity. The John Harris, who I worked with, was a great guy. And I came in the office one day, I think it was my second or third co-op, and he had gotten a commission to design an addition to a country club. And I had been out there with him to, have lunch. Didn't play golf then, but wish I would have. It's a beautiful course. But we went out there and then we came back to the office and he was working on the drawings. And I looked at it in my mind, it looked like a Pizza Hut. And this country club was a 1912 stone kind of, Macintosh type building. It was absolutely beautiful. Wow. And it was one of the old country clubs where the young men actually lived upstairs. And that's what the original golf clubs were like. The men would live upstairs and then they'd have the club and then they'd have the golf club and so on. And so it was there. So we had to design this 19th hole, which was a big restaurant, and then new locker rooms and all that. So I made the comment to John. I just kind of casually walked in his office, because he had a fellow draftsman doing this. And I said, "John, are you happy with the design of that addition?" They said, "Well, it's okay." And I said, "Well, I don't like it at all. I mean, it's not my place, but I just don't like it at all. I think it's ridiculous. It doesn't relate to the structure at all, the existing building, which is beautiful." He said, "Well, what do you think we should do?" And I said, "Well, you mind if I take a crack at designing it?" He said, "No." So this was like a Friday afternoon. So I spent that Friday, Saturday, Sunday, worked 3 all-nighters almost. And he came in Monday, and I had the drawings that I had done kind of taped around the conference room. And he walked in, and his only expression was, "Oh, my God." He goes, "You look terrible. This looks marvelous. Go home and get a shower. We're going to go over to the country club and present this at noon." So I got a shower, dressed. We went to the country club, presented it. They loved it. Ultimately, the working drawings were completed, and it was built, and it won, and then submitted for State of Ohio AI Design Award, which it won. And John had credited me as the design architect, even though I wasn't registered. I was a student. So my relationship with his draftsman went in the basement, because he was about 7 years older than I was, and he was, very upset that I did this. And then when I went back to school, my last 2 semesters, the professors, they always looked askance at me because they didn't even get close to ever sniffing a design award. And here I won this. So I went to work for John after that and did some great things. It was with John where I really started experimenting with with a lot of the things I do today. I mean, at that time, I was reading Mazzari's Passive Solar Home. I visited Malcolm Wells, read all of his stuff, and I loved his sketches and his underground work, and actually met him, drove out and met him. Gary Wright out in California that was doing rammed earth. I visited with him. And so through a combination of those influences, I began to start to do that. And John, to his credit, just let me go. And I designed, I think, 4 passive solar homes, John, during that period. And they were strictly passive. Solar systems at that time were primarily water, and they were hot water based for heating. You had to be a master plumber to maintain them. So we didn't make much progress in terms of promoting solar. But what we did do is I really learned how to design what I call passive sustainability. And that is designing the shell of a building, the envelope, to be as optimized as you can with just as close as possible to the optimum amount of glazing, not too much insulation, just the right amount of insulation, with weaving nature into the site, into the buildings, into these homes. And so that worked out very well. Well, about the same time, Texas was exploding down here. And my name, because I had won that design award, had come up in a couple of things. And I got a call from a headhunter. And he said, we have a firm in Dallas. Actually, he said, I have 3 firms in Dallas that would like to talk to you about moving to Texas. And so I said, sure. At that point, I loved John. John offered to make me a partner. And I was cavelling over that because it was like, oh, John, I love you. I think this is I love this office. I love working with you and the other guys. I hate Ohio. I can't stay here. And I told him I had that opportunity. He goes, well, go check it out. Partnerships here. You make a decision. So I came down here, and all 3 firms offered me a job as designer in their firms. Went back up to Ohio, told John I was leaving. I took about a 7-month sabbatical and just traveled the country, saw a lot of architecture I wanted to see, visited a lot of old hotels, stayed in national parks. And at the end of the 7 months, and I, came down here and went to work for one of those firms. Turned out very well. They ran out of work, and when they were running out of work, the partner that hired me said, well, we don't have any work. We don't want to have you do working drawings. We'd like you to talk to a friend of ours. So I went there, and it was GSA, Gordon Sybeck, and Gordon's design studio it was awful. It was awful. The work they were producing was so bad. They were losing clients. Sybeck heard about what I had done for Harper Kemp Clutson Parker. And so he hired me on the spot to be his design director at lunch. And then I worked for GSA for about 7 years. And it was with GSA that I really began to bring what I had developed as a young architect into larger commercial work. We were doing a lot of work for Melvin Simon Property, and some other developers. And Melvin would dismiss anything I talked about in terms of what I was doing until we were doing a huge mall project. And I had my engineers, mechanical engineers, run a calculation, tell me how many tons of air conditioning I could reduce the design they had if I took the roof insulation from a 3/8" recovery board up to an R42. And we cut the mechanical systems by 2/3.
Wow.
And so I went to Mel and I said, Mel, okay, the insulation is going to cost X. We're going to reduce the mechanical systems by Y. This is going to reduce your capital investment by this. And his only response was, he took his cigar out of his mouth and he goes, what's not to like about this? Do it. And so we did that. And then I started doing other things like ceiling tile, friable, cellulose ceiling tile. In big projects like that, we were doing shopping malls, we were doing big box stores. Ceiling tiles are a problem because of roofs leak, all kinds of other problems. And you're constantly taking them down and throwing them out.
Let me ask you a question, Gary.
Yeah.
Why do you think all these, business leaders or these folks along your early career journey, I mean, why'd they give you all these opportunities? And what do you think they saw in you? Was it just the proactiveness, you're going to see it all the way through? It's just your enthusiasm. I mean, what did they see in you? Because you just told some great stories about how, frankly, you were handed some great entrepreneurial opportunities along the way. So what do you think it was at the time?
I think a lot of it was enthusiasm. I heard there was a contractor that worked with John quite a bit, Galen Oakes, interesting guy as well. But his son and I became pretty good friends. And his son told me one time, I designed their lake house, and I designed probably when I was with John, 6 office buildings for him. And his son told me, he said, I don't know what it was, but you're very enthusiastic. You've always been enthusiastic. You're just gonna see a lot of success in your life. And I can't put my finger on it other than you're very sharp. When I was working with Melvin Simon and enterprise development, I remember Bob James telling me one time, and these are just anecdotes, I don't really share these with folks, but Bob told me one time, he said, we're in these meetings, sometimes they're contentious with tenants, with utilities, with whatever, bankers. And he said, you never lose your cool. And you're just quick on your feet. And you've got an answer and you've got an ability to bring people to a solution without being controversial. So I think it was just some of those aspects that were part of my innate personality, I guess.
That's awesome.
And I think it was a good bit of confidence. Just when I look at what's the first thing I did was learn how to use a damn hammer and learn how to use a hammer and what's the right size nail. It's kind of like Louis Kahn saying you can't build with bricks until you understand the brick. And that's true. I mean, I have young kids and young men, architects and women, and I'll look at a dimension on a drawing and I'll say, okay, you've got 16 feet, 3 3/8 inches. That's not a brick dimension. And they're like, what do you mean? Well, the only way that works is you've got to cut a brick. Yeah. And if you cut a brick, it's not the full dimension. Or, a sheet of plywood, 4x8, 2x4s, 1.5 by 3.5. And so it's things like that I think I just always had an innate sense about.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be curious to follow up on how do you teach that without getting someone hands-on and really showing them in the field and learning from a craftsman. But I was really smiling ear to ear when you talked about the hammer. My dad was a journeyman carpenter, and he really showed me an East Wing and just a framing hammer and just the other hammers you mentioned. So I was smiling when you told that story. But, we got to talk about sustainability. So you had all that influence early on, and you studied several different techniques, and you went out and saw those that were early adopters of these different techniques. I definitely want to talk more passive design in a minute, but how did you know you want to do more with sustainability? Is it just something that you gravitated towards? You want to make sure, hey, every design you do going forward, you're going to make sure it at least has some sustainability in it? I mean,
I think, Charlie, to be honest, it's something I just gravitated toward. And I just recalled when I was a kid on the farm, we had a farm. Well, it was a steel mill. Dad had the steel mill, but he also had a farm. And I remember our farm lane was always, people would drive up and down that farm lane and throw their trash out, their garbage bags, right out along the side. And this was a beautiful beech forest to drive through. And beech trees, if you've ever seen them, they're just majestic. And so one day I got my brother and we hooked up the tractor and the trailer and we went down the lane and we picked all those trash bags. We loaded them into the trailer, took them to the house. And Dad came home and he blew a cork and he said, well, what are we going to do with that? I'm going to take them to the dump. They're going to pay us for tipping fees. And I said, well, yeah. Anyway, he begrudgingly paid to dump all that. But then about a week later, he said, it's a real pleasure to drive down that lane and not see any trash. I'm glad you did that. And so that was just kind of there, spent a lot of time outdoors. I had a biology teacher when I was a sophomore who was really, and I can't remember his name, and I tried to find him, but he did, our biology class was all about, he hosted we spent the entire semester to host a natural picnic. There was going to be no trash generated. We were going to harvest everything naturally as to the greatest degree possible or get it from local farmers. And so we had this picnic. We made homemade root beer. We made sunflower seed ice cream. All kinds of things we did that it was just really, really, really cool. And I just sort of fed my, natural interest. And then when I got to school and I started just gravitating people like those early pioneers like Malcolm Wells, Gary Wright, Mazzari, who was writing the Passive Solar book, reading Frank Lloyd Wright's writings, which are, they're tough to read. Wright's Victorian tense and the way he writes and word choice and the length of his sentences and how the sentences are structured. It's very difficult to read Frank Lloyd Wright's writing. But in every bit of his work, and he talked about organic architecture and diffusing the boundaries between the inside and outside and all of those kind of things, organic materials, kind of the organic placement, mimicking buildings to, work with the site. His early prairie style was horizontal because the prairie. He understood shading. He understood passive solar. He didn't call it that, but he just understood how to size overhangs. So you got sun in the winter, his radiant floors, the natural colors. And that was a big influence on me as well. And I think from that moment, something just gelled. And then it's just always been an innate interest of mine to to do just that, to weave nature into the structure of the building.
I love in your write-up when you talk about your firm, about environmental responsiveness. And, I want to talk more about your company in a minute, but just look back on the highlight reel. I want to give you permission. I give all my guests permission. Hey, what's on the highlight reel, Gary? You're a LEED fellow. That's incredible. Congratulations, for example. What else stands out as you look back over your career here?
I think, I'm often not very reflective.
Humbling, yeah.
I think that opportunity with that country club design certainly was fundamental. I'd say it, but I think work with Norm Broad. I mean, the man could swear better than anybody I knew, but he never swore at you. He was swearing at what you just screwed up. But working with him was incredible. I had the opportunity to, another story, again, a highlight. When you think about those learning opportunities, if you recognize that you've got something to learn from everyone. There was a 56-year-old master carpenter I worked with, and we were putting this really beautiful cedar, it's like 1.25 inch cedar, rough sawn cedar, a siding on this gabled end of a house. And so we were putting the cedar up, and when we were done, we were about 4 boards short from finishing it. And the carpenter comes up in his pickup truck and he said, "Why isn't that done?" And I said, "Well, ran out of material." "How'd you run out of material?" I said, "I don't know. Dick was cutting. I was giving him dimensions." Turns out he had and I wish he would have given me the little notebook sketch. He had figured out every board and where every cutoff could be used. We would have had a board left over. And he goes, "Your material is in that scrap pile." He berated me and he said, "Do you realize that is beautiful material, and now all you're going to do is burn it because we can't use it anywhere else. And I've got to order more material now, which is more cost." So that was a highlight. I think that was a lesson. And then I think that opportunity with John, as I said, the country club, when I got to Dallas working for Harper Kemp Klutz and Parker, they gave me the assignment to design. Dallas was building the new magnet school, Skyline Magnet School, and they needed a master plan to study 5 sites. So I didn't know Dallas from anywhere. So I really jumped in and developed a master plan, visited all 5 sites, analyzed all 5 sites, had to really dig down transportation, connections, neighborhoods, context, designed all 5 of those, got to present that to the city. Just before I left school, I worked for a firm in Milwaukee. They had it was a subsidized Section 8 housing project that was right below Pabst Brewery. You drive up to the site, it smelled like bread. And the city hired them. Their contract, the place was terrible. It had been destroyed. I won't get into all the problems, but I really spent a lot of time doing a feasibility study and recommending solutions for the problems. Got to present that to the city of Milwaukee, to the mayor and city council. Got a lot of accolades from that. They actually built part of it. And then I left. And then, of course, that happened with ultimately getting down here. And then when I got down here, I had that opportunity to be director of design and then director of marketing. And then I started my own firm. And when I did that, some of those highlights were where I had an opportunity to meet. I met a wonderful man out in East Texas, Harold Nix. He had an old cotton warehouse, beautiful building, but it had been so abused and it was in such terrible shape. And Harold was from Dangerfield and he wanted that building renovated for his offices. So we did that, or I did that I hired an intern. And we renovated that building, and it turned out just beautiful. And that won an award. Yeah. Then the courthouse next door to it was a courthouse that Harold remembers as a child, and we renovated that courthouse. And so then I worked on the Texas Main Street program, going to a number of small cities on a volunteer basis and looking at these old historic, Victorian town squares, city squares, where the retail's on 4 sides and the courthouse is in the middle. And that was just the richness of that, and learning how Victorian Texas towns really operated. So there were just so many highlights from that. And then after that, then a number of other things started to happen. I designed my own home, and following that, there's a fellow here in Dallas called Howard Garrett, and Howard has a show called The Dirt Doctor, and he's an organic landscape expert. And Howard and I are still friends, very good friends. And he started an organic show, just, like a garden show in the convention center. And he asked me if I would build a little sustainable demonstration building, kind of a cutaway kind of thing. And so I partnered with a builder here who had been doing some really good work, in terms of energy efficiency and that kind of thing. And so I designed this thing, and we used SIP panels, and was the first time we really exhibited tankless hot water and all of the principles about passive solar and non-toxic paints and all those sort of things. And it was a hit. It was the most visited exhibit in the entire conference. Out of that, we were challenged to design a home for a young woman. Her name was Heather. And it was under 2,000 square feet. At the same time that LEED was looking at, USGBC was looking at developing a rating system for homes. So Heather's home was entered into the pilot. And so I helped write the pilot with several other people, one just myself. And Heather's home was one of the homes in the pilot. Ultimately, that home was awarded LEED Platinum certification, first in the United States, first in Texas. And that's an incredible home. And that was a highlight because it led to a lot of different really exciting residential commissions. Just prior to that, to Heather's home, when I was doing my home, we were, the Dallas chapter of USGBC was underway, which was a highlight, working with the chapter. And I served on the Texas chapter for a long time, 7 years as a board member, then chair, then co-chair, or co-chair, chair, then the next chair, and then went to the regional committee, and then ultimately to the national committee.
Yeah, I want to talk about that because I see the volunteer work you've done with the USGBC and with AIA. And so can you speak to those that maybe, what would you say? I mean, you got to get involved and not just get on a committee, but go into it. I mean, you've been serving for years and years. So what has that meant, maybe your career between USGBC and AIA?
Well, it's very important. And I think, and I've also done a lot of civic volunteer work, and I would encourage any young professional, get involved at whatever level, wherever you can, because first of all, I think it's important that we give back. And as architects, if you've got a sustainability focus and you understand how important it is to re-envision, if you will, our cities in a sustainable profile and think about all those things that impact it, it's important. So, early on, I had started, I volunteered to be on an advisory committee for White Rock Lake, which is near my home here. And I served on 7 advisory committees, reforestation plan, management plan. We worked to convince the city to stop mowing the grass around White Rock. And I convinced them because I showed them that, look, you could save this labor, you could save all this machinery maintenance, you could save gas, you could save, look at the pollutants. And we ran numbers and what the pollutant load would be if they stopped mowing it. And let's let most of this go back to natural grassland. Well, now I consider that one of the most important things I did civically, because people now rave about all the wildflowers and native grasses and the bird population that's at White Rock Lake. So that was just from a simple volunteer effort. And there's probably 24 more things like that I've done in the city on different kinds of advisory. The Arboretum here in Dallas, it's on Northwest Highway. And I got a call where they wanted me to participate because they were going to build a 12-foot high wall all the way down Garland Road so that you couldn't see into the Arboretum to screen it. Got involved with that. We convinced them that was kind of garish and it was offsetting. And we ultimately worked with their landscape architect to design these beautiful stone columns with bowls of bowl planters with flowers on top, put a chain link fence in between and planted that with bushes, a shrubbery. And then we lined the street with bur oak trees. So now you've got a green barrier that does everything that they wanted in terms of privacy, sound reduction, those kind of things, but it's not this giant masonry wall, like a prison wall. And again, that was just participation. There's a bridge here in Dallas that, it was just a road that was on the northern part of the city. It's in my neighborhood. Every time it would rain, it would flood. The water would get to 5-6 feet deep. Emergency vehicles couldn't get through it. People couldn't move from one side to the other. So the state came in, the state of Texas, the TxDOT, Texas Department of Transportation, and they proposed this bridge that looked like, it was just a concrete thing and awful. And so I pushed them because I wanted to lift it so that we could have a contiguous wildlife corridor so that wildlife could move from way up north of Frisco, all the way down White Rock Creek, under that bridge and get into White Rock Lake. And to do something other than just a concrete what you see everywhere. And that turned out we got a lot of the neighborhood behind it. And now it's a beautiful bridge, beautiful stone bridge. It's got really, really just the detailing is nice. It's just wonderful. And it really sets the tone for White Rock Lake. And everybody, loves that bridge. And it's a long bridge. And then we, bike paths have gone in down there. So all of those little things, someone can get involved in their city. Maybe it's just they're planning a new bike trail or there's a park that's really run down. Well, take charge. Get out there and look at the park, draw a plan, redesign it, put some plants on it, take it to Parks and Rec, see if you can, enlist some excitement and enthusiasm and get the city behind it and, your local neighbors, get them excited and do it. But I think sometimes, it's something as small as that. My boys, you mentioned you had 3 boys. Most of my boys were in scouting, and their elementary school, which is across the street from where I live, had no trees on the campus, none, because it was cotton field one time. So I started growing volunteer trees, collecting acorns from oak trees and potting them up. The boys would help me. I had the Cub Scout pack do that. And by the time they hit Boy Scouts, these trees were, 6, 7, 8 feet tall. So my son Ryan and my son Ian both did Eagle Scout projects, planting those trees on that campus. And now it's incredible. I mean, all the teachers sit they move picnic tables under the shade of those trees, playgrounds full of trees. And it's just turned out to be a wonderful volunteer effort. And I always told all the boys that worked in those projects, I said, look, you're planting a tree today. I'll be dead. I want you to come back here when you're 60 years old. And I want you to sit under this tree and enjoy the shade and realize you planted that tree, because it's the wise man who plants a tree whose shade you will never sit under.
So many good nuggets in there, Gary, you're giving us. So, tell me just about 1 or 2 projects your firm's working on now. You mentioned you had a couple projects kind of hot and heavy right now. So just paint a picture. What kind of projects are you working on right now?
Well, I'll give you one we finished recently, and then I'll get in a couple of new ones. We finished the city of Plano, their environmental learning center. Demonstration building. It has living roof, net zero. We have solar panels. We have a shaded outdoor education area, which is the solar panels. All the paving is permeable. There was a creek that runs beside it. It's the last open waterway in the city of Plano. We engaged the city, and now that creek has been restored to a natural riparian habitat. So the kids, and it's got education displays, and so the landscaping is all indigenous landscaping. As I said, the building is net zero. It uses virtually no energy, generates more power than it needs, which we cycle the excess to Plano warehouse next door. Beautiful building. It's won a number of awards. Then we so a couple of current projects. We have this is for the city of Plano. It's their High Point Tennis Center, and they've got an existing clubhouse on the tennis courts there, and so we reoriented the tennis courts, getting them a tournament court, and we're designing a brand new building for them. The first floor is sort of their pro shop, and where the restrooms are and all that sort of thing, and pro storage. And then the second floor is all tournament gatherings, observation deck, wraps all around so people can look at the tournament courts. And it's still under construction, but it's turning out to be really spectacular because, again, the fellow that he's since retired because we started the project several years ago. His goal was this was going to be the last building he was going to be involved with the city before he retired. He wanted it to be a work of architecture, and he wanted it to be, which is why I was selected, he wanted it to be the most sustainable building Plano ever built. And it really is. I mean, we're going that direction. Now, they didn't want to pursue LEED certification because they've got some people in the city who they still don't quite get it. But it would be LEED certified in a snap. If they just and the response to me was, well, we know we're going to get a LEED building from you. We just don't need the damn plaque. Well, yes and no. I mean, you need to acknowledge the kind of building it is, but it is an extraordinary building. And the building we're currently working on is a headquarters for the Rolling Plains Quail Research Center. Here in Texas, we've got a real problem with losing our quail, our prairie quail. So this is a research headquarters, has a lab, it has an educational contingent, classrooms, it has a bunkhouse. They bring in, I think it's like 16 vets for a 90-day period, and these veterans are taught wildlife management, quail management, ranch land management, and they stay on site. And then there's a kind of a funder's cabin, which is a really cool little cabin back in the trees that has 2 or 3 bedrooms in it. Well, this building is also pretty interesting because we're doing things that we have tried but have not been able to do. We've got, part of it has a living roof. It's bermed. The entire north side of the building is bermed. It's all oriented for passive solar. The mechanical systems are so small to heat and cool it that it was kind of, the contractor can't even believe that how minimal the units are. All natural materials. We're making it, when I talk about weaving something into the nature of the place and weaving nature into the building, this building is going to look like it simply has grown out of the prairie.
Wow, I can't wait to see it.
It's that low profile, and all the daylighting and the way we've oriented the building is the buildings aren't straight. They kind of jog to mimic kind of a ridge behind it. We're doing rusted corrugated siding on the outside. So again, the point about this building, which they had, when they came to me, one of the board members knew my work. The board had already gotten a proposal from a contractor. He was going to build 5 little buildings. Each little building was kind of a little wood building with hardy board. Each one had a roof and a porch and all this paving. And I started to break it down and said, okay, let's look about this. What's your mission? Well, our mission is to research what's going wrong with the quail, preserve quail, and enhance the regeneration of the quail. I said, well, don't you think the building should speak to that? Plopping 5 of these little, buildings doesn't make any sense. And why do we have to have all those roads? And why couldn't we just have a decomp granite road that comes up to it? And then I talked to them about berming it and using the building as a demonstration vehicle for what their mission is. And they were all mesmerized. And it's going to cost a little more than what they originally thought. But we started talking about rainwater harvesting. We're going to do PV solar on it. As I said, just the passive sustainability of the building has reduced the mechanical load substantially. And then when I said, you're not even going to know this building is here until you drive up to it and walk around the front of it where the glazing is facing south. You're going to see the one north light scoop that brings north light in the classroom from the parking area. But that's all you're going to see. Everything else, the prairie is going to come right up and tuck this building into it. And I said, that's your message. And if you begin to talk about this building and how it relates to prairie preservation, restoration, where the building really becomes part of the landscape and all of this is restorative, I think that's only going to bring more attention and notoriety to your mission. Yeah. And that's what we're doing.
What an amazing project, man. You really lit up with that. Well, I'd love to ask you this next question. Sustainability, the green building movement. What should we be reading up on, Gary? What do you think's coming around the corner or maybe already trending?
Well, you've got a couple of things. I think, our urban centers, there's actually 2 parts. Part of it, 3 parts. I think sprawl's just continuing to go on and on and on. And you've got those subdivisions and you realize, sometimes I get a little depressed. Okay, so I designed 2 or 3 net zero, basically environmental zero, with zero ecological footprint as best as I can get to it. But then I realized I do 2 or 3 of those a year. And in the Metroplex, 30,000 homes a year are built. And they're all the same tract homes. And you look out as you're driving the interstates here and you look out and you see a subdivision with 350 homes. And they all have easy bake oven roofs, black shingles, high pitches, more volume under the roof than in the house. The streets are rabbit warren. None of them are facing, the proper orientation. So I think that's a challenge. How do we get to the point where we begin to replan those neighborhoods to be more responsive to what the appropriate regional environmental response is? I'm not saying all the roofs have to have solar panels, but there is a place for solar, but you first got to design these houses differently. And you've got to design these neighborhoods differently. And I think, when you've got issues like everyone has a backyard, everyone has a driveway, and then they're using chemical fertilizers and pesticides on the lawns, and you've got all the lawn services, and you've got all the fences. I think the biggest challenge there, and I think it's going to happen. I think you're going to see more of rights thinking, which is more of an organic approach to planning and construction of these homes. Then you've got urban centers that really were built without recognition of the human response. Now in Dallas, fortunately, that's changing. We're seeing a lot more green space happening. So in other words, where buildings had big parking lots next to them, well, the parking lots are being dug up. They're putting underground parking garages and creating parks on top. And now we're starting to link those parks so that a squirrel could basically jump all through downtown Dallas without ever having touching a tree or touching the ground, just go from tree to tree. So I think what's coming around the corner is I think a lot of young people, new professionals, are really starting to think about this integrative design, holistic design, so that when we start designing a building, well, how can we link this building perhaps with some green space that we can use to capture runoff, that we can design a park so that people who are in the building can come outside, spend more time outdoors. How does that park link to another park? How does our transportation network become more efficient so that we don't have as much vehicular traffic in our cities? So I think that's really what's around the corner is making our urban centers much more human scale, much more welcoming the natural element into our urban centers, just like designing our streets differently so that it isn't hard pavement and then you put trees in a little 4x4 concrete tree well and the tree lives about 7-8 years and then dies and then you got to replace it. Or you can design the street itself to capture and absorb that storm water, and so the trees then can send their roots out under the roadways and things like that and be there for a couple of hundred years. New Orleans is starting to think differently about their urban center, where they have begun to realize trying to wall out and dam the water doesn't work. They need to rethink the city planning so that it'll absorb the water. So when they do get a flood surge, it'll come in and some of these parkways will become waterways until the water subsides. So you've got episodal wetlands. Really see that in the urban, what's happening and what's around the corner with urban centers is how do we begin to welcome the natural response, integrate the natural response into our urban centers. And I think the other thing around the corner are existing buildings. I mean, the building I office in, we renovated. It was 76,000 square feet. We carved a big hole in the middle, put a courtyard in. It was a warehouse. It was windowless. We put windows in it. It's going to be LEED Platinum. It's going to get a WELL certification as well. And this building was scheduled for demolition. Instead, the fellows I worked with bought it for a song, and we did this really cool kind of rustic, rough renovation to it, and everybody loves it. And it has really, everybody kind of responds to it. When they come in there, they comment on, wow, this building it just feels different. It just feels nice in here. And the whole first floor is a co-working space. And part of their success is that the users really enjoy that space down there, because from virtually every space you can view the courtyard. We put in 11 lofts, small lofts. So, looking at buildings rather than tearing them down, there's a real opportunity to renovate them. And in terms of what's around the corner, I think that's a real opportunity, because truly, most sustainable building is the one that's already built.
Totally agree. And, even if we look at some carbon pushes, right, 2030, trying to move towards net zero on our new construction by 2050, we really need to have retrofitted our existing buildings to hit our carbon goals. So, and all of it lines up. So, well, just a few more questions for you. Let's talk more about you, Gary. And, what do you think you're best at? What's your gift?
What am I best at?
Yeah. Or if you were to ask your colleagues, what would they say? Hey, man, Gary's best at this.
Well, it's really, it's a combination of things. I think they would respond that I'm a global thinker. So I think more holistically than most. But at the same time, I can dial down into a small detail that I'm effective in again, I learned how to use a hammer, one of the first things I ever did. So I know the craft, and I think I believe I'm a good craftsman in that when we design our buildings, the details are crafted well. And, they're the inherent talents. I mean, I've got a good sketch hand and my design work is also very strong. So it's kind of like a Renaissance man, in terms of architecture. I can look in a detail and understand how it's going to fit together or it's not going to fit together. I can embrace situations in the field where something wasn't done the way it was supposed to be, but how do we resolve it so that it is a successful resolution? So there's good people skills there. And so it really is, kind of jack of all trades.
Love it, man. No, it's a really fun conversation. Well, let's talk about best practices, routines, rituals. Gary, do you have any best practices that help you stay successful, stay on point? And good habits.
The good habits are we've really worked hard here in the office to have a system that works. In other words, when we start a project and we start we start with the preliminary design and the sketches, and we start working through that. From that moment, we start putting the building together. And we sort of track that. We've got a process in the office where we track that to make sure that original intentions and programming is carrying all the way through the building. And what we've really enjoyed of late is we've been able to convince our clients to bring the contractor on board early. Let's make a decision on a contractor based on qualifications. They see the appropriate size for this project. Get that contractor on board right at the schematic design phase so that we're going back and forth through the entire process. And I think that's probably one of the best practices we have, because when we have them under contract, we're relying on them to look at the documents we're preparing from the eyes of the builder. What's missing? Do you see anything that doesn't work? Do you have any recommendations for a different way to do it? And so there's always that two-way conversation going on three-way, really. The owner's involved in that process as well. So we have this ongoing communication between contractor, our office, and our owner. And of course, our office includes when I recommend our consultants. And we work towards that end. So in my office, we're still big fans of face-to-face, standing over we've got a big table in the middle of the office. And the drawings are out there, and it's a daily exchange about things. And I require all of my staff to have a notebook. And it's pretty funny. A lot of the young people don't like to take notes. They want to use Evernote, and Evernote's great. You can use Evernote, but I want a notebook because I want to see in your sketchbook. I want to see where you've noted this. We've talked about it. I want to see you sketch something. Why don't you draw it by hand? Because then I know you can see it, because you can't see it on the computer. But if you draw it, you have to see it in your mind in order to draw it. That's where you're going to be able to track what you're doing and make sure it aligns with what we're up to. That's one of our best practices here, is getting people to use a sketchbook. Carry it with you all the time. Yeah. We still build rough models. I mean, it's great. You can do great things on the computer. I'm not saying you shouldn't. But what I've encouraged my guys to do here is I've even gotten some of them to, pick up a watercolor set, colored pencils. There's something about that. Just do me a sketch and throw some watercolor on it. Because I think what that does in terms of best practices, I think it shifts your mind from basically an orthogonal exercise on the computer to more mind-hand, that cognitive process that goes on then. And then when you integrate those, I think that's where you use that sort of cognizant process, and you integrate it with, programs and conversations about budget, materials, integration of details, and then back to the computer. And I think that's probably one of the things that we do best. Our other best practices are, I require everyone to do their own red lines before they give it to me. And then I do a red line and I go through it in detail. And they all know that I'm happiest when I have to put very few red marks on a set of drawings. And part of that's training, so it's mentoring. I guess one of our best practices is mentoring. I'm always mentoring. It's every hour in the office. I don't just say, do this. We try to work to where, okay, this is why we're doing this. Do you see it? Can you understand it? So there's a lot of mentoring that goes on here. Mentoring them about shop drawings, mentoring them about, it's sad to say, but people like Wright and the early mid-century guys didn't have to worry about this. We do. And it's called liability exposure. Sure. Errors and omissions, So I'm constantly beating them up on that. No, you don't say that to a contractor. No, you don't put that on the shop drawings. And so teaching them what are the boundaries of responsibility through the construction process. So mentoring is a big deal. And a lot of firms don't get that. I mean, I've had young people come to work for me and they'll tell me it's the first time anyone's ever had a conversation with them like that. They're just told what to do or handed something. And
such missing out, those companies that don't do that. What you just told me, Gary, is that you know the DNA of your company, and that's amazing. So really what makes up a firm that you want to see and kind of a legacy there. You know what you like. And I bet if you ask any of your team members, they can recite everything you just shared with us, that's what your company's about. So thank you for sharing. I hope that made others think about what's really the DNA of the company they're at, those best practices. So, well, my next question, just a couple more here. I'm a fan of a bucket list. So Gary, what's on the bucket list? What are one or two things on your bucket list?
Well, my next home. The next house I'm going to build.
All right. You already sketched it out a little bit or what?
Oh, yeah. It's going to be built. It's going to come off the side of a hill. And when I stand out on the edge of the balcony, it's going to be about a 60 to 120 foot drop. And I really want it to be kind of just using everything that I know. I mean, the house I'm in now is, of course, incredible. And it was not LEED certified because of the before LEED, but it still has in the Metroplex the highest PERS rating ever built. And so that's on my bucket list to build the next one. The question is where is it? Is it going to be in California? Is it going to be in Arizona? Where it's going to be? Which is sort of my bucket list. I really want to open a branch office. Nice. Probably not in California. Probably Arizona. I built a few projects in California. It's just very difficult to build out there.
Sure.
So that's on the bucket list. I think what's also my bucket list is at some point I would like to be able to string together longer time off so I can do some, a little bit more travel and sketching and writing, which, when you're actively designing projects and managing the construction of those projects, as you can well imagine, it's very time consuming. And so I don't get out of here as often as I like. So I'd like to do a little more of that. Sure. The branch office, like I said, I'd love to have a branch office.
Very cool.
I don't have any aspirations to teach, do anything like that. I mean, I'm bugged by that I'm pestered all the time by friends of mine who are in academia. In fact, I'm going to be teaching a course, about a 4-class session for a friend of mine down in Houston at their School of Architecture. That's going to be kind of fun.
You're mentoring internally and, you're guest lecturing. I mean, hey, man, just you're putting out some great projects and doing your thing. Well, let's talk about books, though. Who knows? They say everybody has a book in them. Maybe one day you write a book. But how about books that you would recommend? Or is there one or two? It doesn't even have to be sustainability related, but one or two books you'd recommend.
Oh, wow. That's a good question. Oh, I'll go back to the bucket list. One other thing I'm going to do is I really feel like we're actually starting a development company where we can begin to influence the built environment in a stronger way. Because rather than having to deal with a client and convince, we're already there. So fortunately, I have the skills. And so that's on the bucket list, getting our development company off the ground. Books. Oh boy. I read all the time. This is a silly book, but it's pretty fun. And it's The Devil in the White City.
Yeah, I've heard about that, yeah.
And the reason it's a good book is, it's written about the serial killer that was there. But when you learn the story, and I really never even knew this story in college, the story of the Chicago Columbian Exhibition of 1893. And there are a couple of I've since looked at a couple of good photographic folios of it. This thing was incredible, that they built this thing in about a year and a half. First use of electric lighting. First, they pioneered spray painting. Frederick Olmsted designed the landscape. And if you look at the folios, the construction photos, and the Ferris wheel, the first Ferris wheel was built there. Talks about how Ferris, the guy who invented the Ferris wheel, he designed, engineered, fabricated, and erected this thing without any tests. And the day they threw the last bolt in it, they fired it up and started taking people around. And the cars were Pullman cars, 60 people in a car. They'd have 2,200 people on that Ferris wheel. And they did that without a test. They fired it up. So the story is incredible. And the sad part of that story is it burned down 2 years later because it was basically just a lightweight iron skeleton, a lot of wood, plaster. But the images are just incredible. That's a great book to read. I think it'll really kind of bring a lot of interest to a lot of people. Write biography. I guess, is it a biography or Frank Lloyd Wright on architecture? I don't recall the exact title.
Yeah, I'll look it up and I'll put it in the show notes, both of these books, but maybe it's a biography, yeah.
I think it is the biography. But it's my copy is so dog-eared, sticky tab, underlined, noted. It was one of the first books that I read about Wright, and it resonates. That's why I keep going back to it. I still read it today. It's just an incredible book.
We'll definitely link to that too. And as we come to a close here, there's 2-part question I like to close on, Gary. First, what advice do you wish you'd have known a little earlier in your career?
Advice I didn't. That's a tough question because I'll turn it around. I was basically steering my own course. No one talked about sustainability when I was getting started. There was no mentor there for me. I had to find it in books and those sorts of things. So, the advice was, I guess that's hard to say. I think the only other thing that I would mention is that, is it small firm? Is it big firm? Is it, whatever? I think it's a good idea for young architects to work in a small firm where they can do everything. I had opportunities to go to work for Skidmore, Owings & Merrill in Chicago. Helmut Jahn wanted me to come to his studio back in the day when it was just before I graduated, one of my last co-ops. He wanted me to come. And instead, that's when I took that project in Milwaukee, which was great. So I think, I don't know, Well,
I think you hit on some of them when you were talking about what you do in your firm with those best practices we talked about earlier, because I'm sure, you either had a little exposure to that and you're making sure that that still happens as part of the training and the mentorship. But no, man, thanks. Because, the thing I always close on is just, all right, let's pretend someone's jumping in right now. They're listening to this podcast. They're jumping into the green building movement. What words of encouragement do you have for them?
I would say find a firm that's actually, it's part of their DNA. A lot of firms skate the water, but it's not deeply embedded in their DNA. Right. And if you've got a real passion for it, because I still think we're still on the leading edge. There's so much further we can go that I think you need to really start to. Oh, Janine Benyus, Biomimicry. That's another great book.
Okay, yeah, we'll link to that. Sure.
I really think that's the best advice I can give, and really spend the time. If I did anything that I would like to do differently, the firms I work for, I sort of followed opportunities that presented themselves. Yeah, but I didn't pursue firms or I didn't pursue job opportunities early on that may have been more supportive. So instead of John's firm was supportive, but I think someone could have said, that firm's okay. You're going to have some opportunities there, but, maybe you need to go to work for somebody who's so much stronger than you are. Yeah. And that you could learn more. Let's give the
listeners a little practical advice. So peel back the onion one more layer. So, how do I find out if sustainability is really in the DNA of a firm? I mean, I see how many LEED projects they have. I really look at the different designs. I look at what they do on non-LEED buildings. I mean, how do I know, if it's someone I'm just, interviewing with, or I'm researching, or maybe I am asking peers that know of them? How would I know it's in their DNA? Any advice there?
Go visit their buildings.
Okay.
Walk their buildings, and then certainly walking their buildings. And I think visit the office and just, just talk. I mean, if they're willing to take the time to talk to you, I think that's
simple, but that really does make sense, right? Sometimes we might forget to really go and give it, if this is somewhere you're going to make a career at, you got to go. Hey, if I'm the employer and I hear a candidate say, hey, can you, give me access to your last 5 or 6 projects? Like, I'm already going to be impressed, so.
Right. And then go out and look at them. Or, there's projects published all the time and all the slicks. And, go out and look at those. I mean, even now, even with my career, I still visit a lot of buildings. And I visited a lot of Frank Lloyd Wright buildings. I visited a lot of, Neutra's buildings, Schindler's buildings. I was in Los Angeles recently, went and saw some of Schindler's work. And I, it's still, I'm never surprised that I'm overwhelmed at the experience of seeing something in a building, even where I am at with my career, that's just stunning and inspiring. Yeah. So I think that's the biggest thing and I've always done that. I mean, I used to visit when I was in Ohio. I'd drive around on weekends and go and visit, I'd see these dilapidated old Dutch and German barns, and I would marvel, and I'd sketch the joints, how they put these things together with, just with pegs and mortise and tenon and things like that. I had the opportunity to go to Denmark, and I went out and just went to Roskilde and visited the long ships there in Roskilde where they're building them, and just the craftsmanship that went into those. And funny story there was a wall of tools on the wall, and I noticed that they had adze And the adze, that's where like a pick, they used to shape the beams and pieces and you chop it. And I noticed that all the tools that they must have had probably 90 adze. Each one was like about 1.5 degrees steeper than the next one. And then they had all kinds of augers and rakes and, it's like to create the shapes, they ground that into a piece of steel and then they would drag that. They'd scrape. They were scrapers. So I asked one of the kids there, I said, well, where'd you get all these tools? And I said, I get it. If they needed a 30 degree, they would use 3 different adze to cut the beam until the last one was just the same ergonomic straight stroke would cut a perfect 30-degree angle. And he goes, yeah, nobody's ever mentioned that to us before. He goes, well, we found these. They found a Viking ship sunk out in the harbor, and there was a toolbox in it. And so all these tools, they're new tools, but we copied, we cast, we made molds of all those tools in the toolbox and reproduced them. And, that was enlightening to me that it was the tools that created the expression of those beautiful boats, those beautiful boats. Yeah. So that's why I think, again, I think the more you can see, visit, touch, feel, smell, as someone who's going to be in sustainability, I think that's important. I also think that if someone's really into sustainability, you've got to live it. You've got to make, if you're truly into it, you've got to live it. I mean, I've got chickens in my backyard and they're organic chickens and they free range. And we have eggs and I give eggs to friends and, there's no chemical pesticides or fertilizers that have ever been used on my property. Okay. And I've got amazing wildlife. There's an owl living on my creek now. I think it's 2 owls. And we saw one of the chicks standing up in the nest. So, you really have to live it. When you're walking across the parking lot, do you walk by that crushed Coke can or do you pick it up?
No, you have to live it. And, it's kind of like, I'll use a quick anecdote as we wrap up. For anyone dating right now, a good friend of mine said, hey, I used to drive a Jeep and, manual windows. If you're on a date, and you unlock the passenger side and, the girlfriend gets in, does she unlock your side, or something like that? So you're doing your part there. But, Gary, I want to close with some encouragement for everyone that's listening. We're going to launch this podcast during this coronavirus crisis. And, business is going to be different as we get out of it. But, this too will pass. I don't know if we've ever experienced anything like this. I'm glad a lot of businesses can still continue business as usual. It's hard, and we definitely feel for anyone that's been impacted, of course, if they're sick, but definitely those hourly workers, those restaurants, anyone that is impacted. So I don't know, any final thoughts on that? Any words of encouragement? Some will be listening to this during the crisis we're in right now.
Well, I think what it speaks to is that, we truly are a global species now. It used to be tribal, location-centric, and that led to, worldwide, or led to conflicts, led to brutality. But now we're a global society. So what I would hope comes out of this crisis is that we realize that, what's that saying about a butterfly in Connecticut flaps its wings and a hurricane hits Florida, whatever that is. Yeah. I think it's the same. I think that's the perfect analogy for today, is that we need to begin to realize that we are global citizens. I don't want to make that sound like we need to break down all the barriers and we need to become racially uniform. I think we can celebrate our ethnicity and we can celebrate what's unique about our cultures and where we live. But I also think we need to recognize as we are the human species on this planet. And the great equalizer is something like a pandemic, like a virus that runs out of control. And I think it's going to help us think differently about everything. Like you said, we're going to work differently. I think bricks and mortar, it's becoming more and more where, Amazon has changed the world. And what's really funny is Sears had bricks and mortar all over this country. Any company was in a position to do what Amazon did, it was Sears, because they had all the catalogs, they had all the lines of supply, they had delivery, they had fabrication, they had the entire organizational structure. All they had to do was go to internet and change it to an internet business. Okay. Amazon comes in as an upstart and takes out the biggest retailer on the globe. So I think it's that kind of shift in our thinking where, maybe we don't all have to be fixed to physical construction, so that we can begin to think differently about that. Detroit's a good example where they're tearing buildings down, creating open space because their population decline has left the city much less populous than it used to be. And, the interesting thing about that was biologists have found a species of ringneck pheasant in the Detroit city limits that was extinct everywhere else in the state of Michigan. But then here it is in the urban center of Detroit, because you've got all these places, parking lots, empty lots where buildings have been taken down, and they've gone back to the natural, just the natural biosphere and ecosystem.
Thank you for sharing that. And I just, it's kind of what we opened up with. What does all this make possible? So make sure everybody's thinking that. And when you're listening to this, just stay encouraged. I got to be honest, this was one of the absolute best, because you're an excellent storyteller. And, I laughed a lot. So I hope everybody really laughed a little bit during this one. Gary.
I thought two other books you can put on the list.
Yeah.
Michael Pollan's book, The Botany of Desire, is a great book.
Okay.
These are not architecture books, but they feed into architecture. The other one is Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel. That one is very appropriate to our time right now.
Okay. Well, I'll put a link in the podcast show notes. Well, Gary, man, thank you. Congrats on all your successes. And I can't wait to visit your office when we stop social distancing. Gary, thanks so much.
All right, Charlie, I'd love to see you. Welcome to visit anytime.
I just want to say thank you to our loyal listeners. We actually are celebrating over 1 year here on the Green Building Matters podcast. Me and the entire team were stoked and just so glad you continue to listen every Wednesday morning to a new interview with a green building professional here in this industry, or just some pro tips that we want to make sure that you are getting straight from us, straight to you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Green Building Matters podcast. At gbes.com, our mission is to advance the green building movement through best-in-class education and encouragement. Remember, you can go to gbes.com/podcast for any notes and links that we mentioned in today's episode. And you can actually see the other episodes that have already been recorded with our amazing guests. Please tell your friends about this podcast. Tell your colleagues. And if you really enjoyed it, leave a positive review on iTunes. Thank you so much, and we'll see you on next week's episode.